Most indie games struggle with introductions. And I think that's a shame. I think this is something we can study so that we can create better introductions. And I figured I'd make a couple of videos on that subject. One of the things that we're going to want to discuss is how to actually make an introduction, like writing and pacing and stuff. I'm not going to talk about that here. Nope. I'm going to talk about when to make an introduction. This is something I don't see discussed very much. An introduction is the first thing most players will see of your game, and it might be the last thing if they don't like it. This is when the player decides whether to play your game through or stop. In my opinion, it's one of the most important parts of the game, just period. A lot of indie devs come at developing the game in the same way that a player comes at playing the game. They'll develop the first thing first, and then the second thing second, and so on and so forth. This is not ideal. Let's say that we are a studio with an actual development process, and we've got it all slated out, and then we have a release over here at the end. Woohoo! When do we finalize our introduction? It's usually pretty late. Why? Because this is when the team is at their strongest. This is when the team understands their tools. They've got most of their assets. They are comfortable working with their coworkers. They know all the characters in their game. They know the story and the pace. They know the mechanics and how everything gels. This is when they are at their strongest, so it's when they should create the most important part of their game. Now, obviously, there will be placeholder introductions and the whole thing will be noodled around throughout the entire process. But it's not going to be finalized until, they know they can handle it as best as possible. This varies depending on the studio. A lot of game studios are really inept. For example, if you don't bring your writers in until somewhere down here, this is when your introductory stage gets built. But I think everybody would agree that because the introduction is such a critical part of the flow of the game, it's often better to put it off until your whole team is able to work together very, very well. Unfortunately, this is not how indie games are developed. Indie games are normally chopped up into seasonal releases, early access releases. Are you going to put off your introduction until a year and a half after you've been doing your early access releases? How's that going to work? Are they going to play for a year and a half with no introduction? That's very silly. It would be an interesting experiment to try, but no. The answer is that you're definitely going to have to create an introduction right up front when you're at your weakest, when you don't have any assets, when you don't understand your tools, when you don't really understand your characters or your story or your gameplay. You might think you understand it, you might have theories about it, but this is when you are at your worst. Can you still create a good introduction when you're at your worst? Sure, if you're good at creating introductions, but it's not as good as you could create if you created it at your best. And this is a really nasty situation, right? If you look at early access story-based indie games, most of the time their first release is literally the introduction. Not only is it one of the first things they're making, it's the only thing in that first release when they're at their weakest. How do we deal with this? This is like a fundamental problem with game development. If we're trying to do early access releases, obviously we're going to release the first thing the player sees first and the second thing the player sees second and so on, because that's how we're releasing the game. What can we do? Well, as far as I can tell, the only answer is that in a year and a half or whenever, you're going to have to rewind and overwrite that first introduction. Now that you actually know what's going on, you're going to have to completely clear that slate, throw it in the trash, start over, and do an introduction that works better for you, now that you're at the height of your capabilities. Yeah, there's some problems with this approach too. Let's talk Baldur's Gate 3. Baldur's Gate 3 has a massive budget, something like $100 million, but it has an indie game release schedule. It chops itself up into chunks for early access, and these chunks are largely in the same order that the players will play them, which means that their first release contained the introduction. It was bad. Now, I know a lot of people like Baldur's Gate 3, and even like the introduction, and that's mostly because it's very pretty. But in terms of writing, and in terms of pacing, and in terms of mechanical choices, that it does not hold up. It is just not up to par with the standard of $100 million RPGs. In fact, I can name 10 or 15 much, much cheaper RPGs that have better introductions because they didn't make their introduction first. Now, my assumption was that near the end of their development cycle, they were going to go back and overwrite that first phase. But apparently the staff or the board didn't slate for that and doesn't feel like doing that because they didn't. As far as I can tell, they are just going to proceed with making the follow-up acts, leaving Baldur's Gate 3 with a hilariously weak introduction forever. This is nonsense, because the only people who are going to care how good Act 3 gets are the people who were okay playing the game through when it was shit. If they're okay with the poor quality of the introduction here, and they're willing to play Acts 2 and 3 despite the poor introduction, there's no reason for you to make better stuff in Act 2 and 3. They're satisfied. You might as well cut as many corners as you can and make a shitty game throughout. This is not me telling you that Baldur's Gate 3 devs are inept. This is a structural issue. The Baldur's Gate 3 team could be gods of development, and they're still going to face the problem that they are creating their introduction when they are at their weakest. They're doing their weakest work because they are currently just getting started. They don't know anything about it. The introduction they could create, if they created it late in the cycle, would be much, much better, regardless of how good you think the current introduction is. But they're not being allowed to do that because it would take a lot of money. We spent $15 million on that introduction, and you want to spend another $10 million throwing that one in the trash and recreating it? No, that's going to be a big fat no. Budget denied. Release the game. Your game's going to suck forever. Now, of course, Baldur's Gate 3 is a pretty spectacular example of that because of the price tag attached to it. But the same sort of thing goes on even in the smallest indie games. You might have an indie game where you're creating it and it's just, costing you maybe $40 and your own time, whatever. But you're still going to run into the same situation where if you decide, all right, I'm really feeling my game, I'm really comfortable, I'm going to go back and recreate that intro now, you're going to get your players, all 12 of them, going, no, you jerk. How dare you? Going back and fixing stuff? You're supposed to be finishing your game. And they don't seem to realize, ever, that you need to go back and create your introduction so that your game doesn't suck. You might have a few people who are willing to put up with your game as long as it has a sucky introduction, but you're going to find a lot more people who are willing to put up with your game if your introduction doesn't suck. And that means just eating that criticism. You've just got to say, sorry, I have to go back and fix this, even though it makes you think less of me. Just got to be how it is. Good news is these people are not your board, and they do not have to sign off on your time expenditures, so you can just ignore them rather than having your game stay bad forever. Unfortunately, that's not the only problem. It's not just a matter of being, I'm going to go back and fix it later, even if people tell me not to. No, it's also a matter of what's in your introduction. A lot of indie games feature branching paths right there in the introduction. For example, maybe you choose which tool your character is going to use later on in the game, or maybe you choose which faction you're going to ally with, or maybe you choose which person likes you, or maybe you choose which city you're going to start in. Whatever it happens to be, right? These branching paths have numerical effects on the rest of the game. These are flags and values that will propagate forever. So if you go back and you rewrite your introduction better later on, what are you going to do? Are you going to rewrite an introduction that has the exact same choices in it so that you can keep the numbers exactly the same? Because that means that you're inheriting a lot of the choices that you made when you were just getting started and didn't really understand how your game was going to work. But if you change those options, then not only will you invalidate everybody's save, you're going to have to go through your entire game looking for examples of what those new options will change. That's a ton of work. An introduction isn't just, a passive sequence. It's something the player goes through. And if that involves them making choices and defining chunks of their character or their world, that means that those definitions are going to be in your game forever. They're going to propagate forever. And that means that you've got some tough decisions to make in terms of what sort of choices you allow in your introduction, with the understanding that you're going to have to come back later and completely change everything. Do you keep it clean? Do you let it get messy and sort it out later? Do you make it so there's no choices in your introduction? That's the standard way to do it. All of these factors make it very challenging to go back and change your introduction later. But you have to, in my opinion, because your introduction is the most important part of your game, and you want to make it when you are at your strongest. Even if you have to make a crappy introduction first just because you have to release something, and obviously you want to make it as good as you can, but you're never going to be able to make it as good as you can later, because later you'll be better. Later you'll be stronger. What I'm getting at here is, yes, you have to release an introduction if you're doing early access. But you have to understand that that is not your forever introduction. You made it when you were weak and confused. And if you want your players to actually want to play your game, you're going to want to welcome them with something that you create when you are at your absolute strongest. In my opinion. That's it. In the next video, maybe we'll talk a little bit more about how to actually create an introduction. Won't that be fun?